Persian Gulf, mid-1980s. A Soviet MiG-23 patrol cuts through the haze at 30,000 feet, cruising eastward along a routine intercept corridor. The sky is clean. The sea below glitters, calm and indifferent. Their radar scopes show nothing. No blips, no threats. Just the familiar silence of a patrol gone exactly as expected. Then the warning tone chirps. The Soviet pilot freezes. It's not a missile lock, not yet. But it's something worse. A soft, repeating tone that means they've been painted, tracked, monitored. The pilot calls it in. The wingman confirms. They scan the horizon, still nothing. No aircraft, no contrail, no signature. They break formation and scan with onboard radar. Still nothing. Their scopes remain empty, but the tone won't stop. Then, without warning, the wingman disappears. 1 second. He's on the screen, flying steady 400 meters off the right wing. The next, he's gone. No explosion, no flare, just silence. Panic hits the cockpit. The pilot pulls into a climb, searches the air behind. Nothing. He dives toward cloud cover, hits chaff, yells into the radio for guidance. On the carrier deck of the USS Constellation, an F-14 Tomcat banks gently westward. Its AWG-9 radar has already cycled through the targets. The Phoenix missile had been fired minutes ago at long range, high speed with no warning. Its solid fuel motor burned out halfway to the target. It coasted silently the rest of the way. There was never a dogfight. There was never a visual. There was just a radar solution, a missile, and then nothing. The MiG pilot would return to base shaken, unsure if the shot had been real or simulated. But he knew what mattered. The Americans had seen him first, locked him first, fired first, and his wingman never fired at all. By the time they entered the fight, it was already over. 6 months earlier, in a lecture hall at Saki Air Base in Crimea, a group of Soviet naval aviators lounged through a briefing on American carrier intercept protocols. The mood was relaxed. Casual arrogance hung in the air like cigarette smoke. On the projector screen was the F-14 Tomcat, its iconic twin tails and swept wings captured from a low-angle satellite image. A political officer walked the group through known specs: maximum speed, weapons loadout, turn rate, fuel limitations. The verdict was unanimous: overweight, over-engineered, overhyped. One pilot leaned back in his chair and snorted. An interceptor built for Vietnam. It's not a fighter. It's a flying barge. Laughter followed. They all knew the stories. The F-14 was fast, yes, Mach 2.3 on paper, but big, too big, easy to spot on radar. Its swept wings were impressive, but its maneuverability suffered under load. Its design philosophy was outdated. Built to counter high-flying Soviet bombers, not engage frontline fighters. They were training in MiG-23s and Su-15s, fast, nimble, brutal, optimized for vertical climb, raw thrust, and rapid reaction. Soviet doctrine favored short-range interception, cannon discipline, and closing the distance. Dogfights were not hypothetical. They were a point of pride. Soviet pilots trained to fight with aggression, with angles, with instinct. The Tomcat, they believed, couldn't survive a real engagement. One flight instructor summed it up. If the American ever shows his face, he's already lost. They build machines, we build killers. Then came the radar diagrams. They reviewed electromagnetic cross-sections. Soviet radars could pick up the F-14 at long distances. No stealth coating, no airframe blending. It was the size of a small building. Even its radar, the much-discussed AWG-9, was dismissed as obsolete. High power, but narrow beam. Easy to jam, easy to fool. The pilots were told that if they baited the F-14 into close range, the Tomcat's size and sluggishness would make it a perfect kill. And besides, no missile could truly strike from 100 miles away. That was NATO fiction, marketing. The Phoenix missile? Overrated. One pilot joked, "It only works in Pentagon test ranges." More laughter. In that room, they believed in thrust-to-weight ratios, in maneuver kills, in turning fights and hard break turns. The F-14 would never see them coming. They believed that speed, bravery, and angle of attack would carry the day. And their laughter was the first mistake. Soviet air combat doctrine was forged in the crucible of necessity. Born from the vast skies of the Eastern Front and hardened during Cold War standoffs, it was built around a few core ideas. Speed wins, maneuver decides, and interception must be controlled from the ground. Dogfights weren't just possible, they were central. Soviet pilots were trained to engage visually, to fight by reflex, and to treat radar as a tool, not a weapon. The foundation was built on mass and proximity. MiG-21s, MiG-23s, and Su-15s were designed with blistering climb rates and narrow turn radii. The kill chain assumed early vectoring by ground-based radar stations. Engagements would happen close, 20 kilometers or less, under conditions of high speed and dense radio traffic. Command posts on the ground would assign vectors, frequencies, and targets. Airborne autonomy was limited. BVR, beyond visual range, was a theoretical option, not a practical one. Soviet missiles like the R-23 or R-24 had claimed BVR capability, but in real conditions with jamming, spoofing, and radar clutter, most kills came in tight. Visual ID was still the standard. That was where Soviet design excelled. Rugged airframes, powerful engines, and G-force tolerance. Weapons were secondary to flying, and every aircraft reflected that bias. The MiG-23 could climb at over 200 milliliters. The Su-27 had thrust vectoring that allowed it to flip mid-air. Soviet cockpits were utilitarian, few screens, no automation. The pilot flew. The system followed, and in that system the Tomcat made no sense. The Americans, it was believed, had overcompensated. They'd built a huge, complex twin-engine interceptor with a volatile radar and missiles the size of bombs. On paper, it looked powerful, but Soviet planners were certain that in combat, the size would betray it. The Phoenix would miss. The AWG-9 would be jammed, and then it would be a dogfight. And in a dogfight, the MiG always wins. But doctrine couldn't see what it didn't understand. Because while Soviet pilots were training for knife fights in the clouds, the Americans had changed the rules. The F-14 wasn't built to outturn the MiG. It was built to kill the MiG before the MiG ever knew it was there. And that idea, that you could fight a war without ever entering the turning circle, was so alien to Soviet thinking that it wasn't considered dangerous. It was considered impossible. It was a routine mission. A slow, steady loop over the Indian Ocean. A Soviet Tu-95 Bear reconnaissance aircraft, escorted by two MiG-23s, was ordered to approach a U.S. Navy carrier group operating southwest of Diego Garcia. The purpose was standard: probe the carrier's position, gather radar signatures, test American response times. The plan was simple: fly within 100 kilometers, bank off, return. Just like they'd done dozens of times before. But this time, the Tomcats were already waiting. At 160 kilometers out, the Bear's radar officer noticed a strange pulse, a long-range sweep, unusual in frequency. He called it in. The MiG scanned the sky. Nothing. At 130 kilometers, the Bear's radar lock warning blinked. At 120, the MiG pilots began evasive maneuvers, diving, flaring, jamming. But it didn't matter. From 100 miles away, aboard the USS Enterprise, two F-14 Tomcats had launched simultaneously. Their radars were already tracking all three aircraft. The AWG-9 had locked targets before the Soviets had even crossed the horizon. Each Tomcat carried one AIM-54 Phoenix, the missile designed for this exact moment. The missiles detached and vanished into the stratosphere. They didn't roar. They whispered. At over Mach 4, they streaked above 80,000 feet, diving in from altitude like stones dropped from space. They coasted silently for most of their flight, guided by radar updates from the launch aircraft. And then, at 96 kilometers, the MiG on the Bear's left exploded. Simulated, of course. This was a non-lethal intercept. But the lock was real. The kill confirmed. The Bear crew panicked. The other MiG lit afterburners. But the second Phoenix was already inbound. It killed the second escort at 82 kilometers. The Tu-95, now alone, continued. When it returned to base, the mission debrief was tense. The pilots had never seen a fighter. They'd never been warned by Soviet radar. They had simply been hunted by a weapons system that had acquired, tracked, and destroyed them long before they entered engagement range. The after-action report concluded with a line that left Soviet air defense planners stunned. No visual contact, no missile trail observed, all targets eliminated prior to standard detection range. The Americans had not just fired first. They had fired from beyond comprehension. This wasn't a radar advantage. This was a paradigm collapse. And when the GRU reviewed the radar logs, they had to admit, quietly and only internally, the Tomcat had erased an entire flight without being seen. The report landed on a polished desk inside the Ministry of Defense building on Frunzenskaya embankment. It was stamped urgent, not for its strategic value, but for the disbelief it triggered. A bare reconnaissance flight had been intercepted over the Indian Ocean, its escorts destroyed by American fighters that no one ever saw. The kill distances, over 150 kilometers. No radar locks, no visual contacts, no return fire. Just long-range elimination, clinical, silent, terrifying. The first reaction was denial. Senior air defense officers dismissed the report as an exaggeration. "Impossible," one general barked. "Fabricated by the Americans to inflate their morale." Analysts suggested radar ghosts, a software fault, perhaps a training exercise misinterpreted by inexperienced pilots. The Phoenix missile, long mocked inside Soviet circles, was at the center of it. In official publications, it had been branded a paper tiger. Too expensive, too unreliable. A missile so large it limited the F-14's payload. Western press had even criticized its performance. Soviet doctrine framed it as a bluff, a tool for intimidation, not war. Now that same missile was showing simulated kill ratios that defied every assumption. A second theory followed quickly. Maybe the radar signatures were faked. Maybe the Tomcats were coordinated with Aegis cruisers or airborne AWACS. No fighter could track and engage at those distances alone. The AWG-9 radar system, they claimed, was fragile, too complex, too easy to spoof. That theory would not survive the month. New reports came in from the Pacific and the Mediterranean, each describing the same impossible pattern. Soviet aircraft would approach American battle groups. They would detect nothing. But onboard sensors would light up, flashes of radar pings, lock warnings, ECM disruptions. Then the drills would end with Soviet kills, executed from beyond their radar limits. In private, MiG pilots began refusing certain intercept paths. "They're already watching us," one muttered. "We just don't know where from." Still, the Kremlin's stance remained. Isolated incidents, lucky guesses, technological tricks. They refused to admit the truth, that the Tomcat wasn't just a platform. It was a kill system that functioned at a range Soviet doctrine couldn't engage, couldn't jam, and couldn't survive. To admit that was to admit failure, not of a mission, but of a philosophy. And so instead they called it fiction. They didn't need new tactics. They told themselves the Americans had gotten lucky, even as the wreckage of every theory stacked up mile by silent mile. The first explanation to gain traction in Moscow was the most comfortable one. The F-14 wasn't doing this alone. Analysts inside the general staff insisted the Tomcat's radar performance couldn't be real, not without help. They theorized that its long-range locks were only possible because of external support. Aegis cruisers, AWACS, maybe even satellite guidance. They claimed the Tomcat wasn't a predator. It was a puppet. In their eyes, the F-14 was just a delivery mechanism, a fast-moving platform receiving pre-calculated firing solutions from massive fleet radars. And if that was true, then the solution was simple: cut the cord. Soviet war planners immediately began designing countermeasures. ECM teams proposed focused jamming against E-2 Hawkeyes. Naval strike squadrons trained to rush American cruisers before air engagements began. Even MiG-31 patrol routes were restructured, no longer to hunt the Tomcat, but to blind its eyes. The theory hardened into doctrine. Flight briefings emphasized disrupting the U.S. fleet's command chain. New exercises simulated heavy radar interference, with fighters instructed to assume the F-14 could not function independently. Soviet tactical journals published confident essays. If separated from its carrier battle group, the Tomcat becomes a deaf and blind interceptor. But there was a problem. The radar tapes didn't lie. Each time a Soviet flight encountered an F-14, whether near a carrier or not, the engagement played out the same. Detection at long range, multiple radar pings, lock warnings, and simulated kills from beyond visual distance. The AWG-9 wasn't bouncing data from an external node. It was doing everything itself, from inside the plane. Unlike Soviet fighter radars, which used narrow beam widths and fixed frequency scans, the AWG-9 operated in multiple modes: track while scan, pulse Doppler, search and track. It could acquire targets through clutter, sort by closure rate, and assign missile guidance without needing constant updates from a ground or ship controller. This wasn't ship-fed accuracy. It was organic lethality. Yet Soviet officers continued to argue otherwise, not because the data supported it, but because their entire combat philosophy depended on it. If the F-14 could kill on its own, from beyond the range of retaliation, then Soviet fighters were obsolete, not in material, but in concept. So they kept repeating the theory: the Tomcat needed a net. Cut the net and the threat would vanish. But the reality was colder. The F-14 wasn't just part of the system. It was the system. And every time it fired a Phoenix from 100 miles out, silently, independently, and fatally, it dismantled a little more of the world the Soviets thought they understood. When the fleet link theory began to fray, when pilots returned from patrols describing radar locks far outside jamming range, even with AWACS absent, Soviet command turned to a darker explanation. If the Tomcat wasn't cheating through external support, then it must be cheating through deception. The second theory, whispered in back rooms and formalized in internal memos, was that American technology had evolved beyond hardware, that they were using radar illusions. Some officers claimed that what Soviet radar picked up wasn't real: ghost contacts projected by electronic warfare suites, decoys, radar reflection tricks, perhaps even AI-generated interference patterns. They speculated that the AWG-9 didn't scan. It spoofed, that the F-14s weren't really tracking anything, just lighting up cockpits with false signals, forcing Soviet pilots to panic and break formation while the real American aircraft slipped away. That the AIM-54 launches were blanks, psychological tools never intended to hit, only to confuse. One particularly bold theory circulated inside a GRU signal intelligence cell: that the Americans had learned to bounce radar signals off the ionosphere to create phantom locks. Impossible to triangulate, impossible to escape. A classified briefing in 1989 went even further. It claimed the Tomcat's radar was connected to a satellite uplink, allowing real-time, space-based fire correction. This was presented without evidence, but the implication was clear. Soviet pilots weren't just losing, they were being tricked. Others latched onto a more human explanation: that American pilots were using some kind of predictive software to anticipate Soviet flight paths. Electronic intuition, they called it, as if the F-14s knew where the MiGs would be before they got there. This theory spread rapidly, because if true, it meant Soviet pilots weren't being outflown, they were being outgamed. Their training, tactics, and instincts weren't wrong. They were just being countered by a computer. Commanders in the Far East began issuing bizarre orders: don't fly predictable patterns, change altitudes every 90 seconds, avoid radio protocols longer than 20 words, instructions designed to avoid becoming data points. But none of it worked. The F-14 still saw them, still tracked, still fired, still won. Because none of the theories were true. The Tomcat wasn't hacking their radars. It wasn't projecting illusions. It wasn't cheating with satellites or spoofing signals. It was simply using something the Soviets had refused to believe mattered: range, speed, and time on target. Every Soviet theory was a desperate attempt to protect an outdated reality. They were trying to explain away a battlefield they didn't control, and a weapon system they no longer understood. In doing so, they didn't evolve. They didn't adapt. They simply stared deeper into the darkness, while the Tomcat hunted silently from beyond it. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union's intelligence agencies faced a growing crisis. Every attempt to penetrate the F-14 Tomcat's true capabilities ended in dead ends. The GRU and KGB threw resources at the problem. Nothing worked. They deployed technical officers disguised as trade delegates to Long Island, home of Grumman Aerospace. The objective was simple: extract radar schematics, missile integration protocols, anything that could explain how the AWG-9 system operated so far beyond Soviet expectations. But the engineers they approached didn't know. Most didn't even work on AWG-9. The system was compartmentalized, locked behind layers of need-to-know clearances and military oversight. The KGB then shifted tactics. They began recruiting U.S. Navy contractors, low-level personnel with access to maintenance schedules and hardware serial logs. But they soon realized the Tomcat wasn't vulnerable at the hardware level. What made it lethal wasn't something you could steal with a camera. It was how the systems worked together. The radar wasn't just long range. It was smart. It knew how to scan in pulse Doppler mode, filter out ground clutter, and maintain lock even through evasive maneuvers. The fire control wasn't just precise. It could calculate missile trajectories in real time for 6 separate targets. The missile wasn't just fast. It was programmable, capable of mid-course updates and terminal active guidance. The Soviets had nothing comparable. The MiG-31 Foxhound, their best interceptor, carried a radar that could track targets at range, in theory. But it couldn't do what the F-14 did: fly solo, acquire targets on its own, and fire at multiple threats without any external direction. The Americans had built not just a better radar, they had built a self-contained kill chain. This confused Soviet strategists deeply, because the Tomcat violated the fundamental logic of Soviet design. No system fights alone. Soviet doctrine assumed network dependency: ground controllers, overlapping radar zones, coordinated attack vectors. But the Tomcat had all of that inside one airframe. Meanwhile, GRU analysts pored over flight tapes from Indian Ocean intercepts. What they saw terrified them. Soviet patrols would enter radar range and instantly trigger multiple locks. Within seconds, simulated Phoenix launches would register. No warning, no chase, just resolution from hundreds of kilometers away. Internal reports grew more desperate. A 1988 KGB analysis concluded the F-14 had redefined interception doctrine. It does not fight at the edge of its range. It fights from beyond it. The conclusion was grim. There was no spy they could turn, no schematic they could steal that would replicate the fusion between radar, fire control, and missile logic that the F-14 embodied. It wasn't one advantage. It was total integration. The Tomcat didn't cheat. It simply rendered every Soviet assumption irrelevant. And for intelligence officers who lived and died by what could be measured, photographed, or stolen, that was the most terrifying failure of all. They weren't just blind. They were obsolete. The Soviets had studied airframes. They had measured thrust-to-weight ratios, analyzed radar cross-sections, and mocked the F-14's bulk. But what they failed to understand, and never replicated, was that the Tomcat wasn't just a fighter jet. It was a complete airborne combat system built not to react, but to decide. At the heart of the F-14's revolutionary power sat the AWG-9 radar. Designed by Hughes Aircraft, it was the first airborne radar system capable of track-while-scan functionality at long range. In practical terms, that meant the radar could sweep massive volumes of sky, up to 370 kilometers in range, detect multiple threats, track 24 of them simultaneously, and guide missiles against 6, all without switching modes. This wasn't surveillance, it was targeting. While Soviet radar systems were optimized for narrowband close-range resolution, the AWG-9 fused speed, pulse Doppler tracking, and a wide angular search. It saw not just where the target was, but how fast it was closing, how it was moving, and how it would likely behave. And it did all this from beyond the horizon. But seeing was only the beginning. The F-14 was armed with the AIM-54 Phoenix, a missile unlike anything the Soviets had ever deployed. At over 4 meters in length and weighing 450 kilograms, it was essentially a rocket, capable of Mach 5, with a reach of 160 kilometers. Once launched, it ascended into the stratosphere, flying a high arc trajectory before diving toward its target. Its secret wasn't just speed, it was autonomy. Mid-course guidance was provided by the Tomcat's radar, but in the final stage, the Phoenix switched to active radar homing. It didn't need the F-14 to survive. It didn't need the pilot to maintain a lock. It hunted independently, calculating closure rate and impact vector on its own, striking before the target ever had a chance to maneuver. This wasn't a weapon for dogfights. It was a weapon to end the fight before it began. The Tomcat systems were integrated in a way no Soviet fighter could match. Its radar, fire control, and missile guidance all spoke the same language. Its pilot and radar intercept officer, Rio, operated in tandem, splitting tasks, multitasking threats, and launching with cold precision. The crew didn't react to threats. They processed them. Even in cluttered environments, over ocean, in heavy ECM zones, near multiple formations, the F-14 could sort friend from foe, scan from below the radar horizon, and pick targets without support from AWACS or ground control. This was not theory. It was practiced, tested, proven. In U.S. Navy training simulations, F-14s routinely achieved first launch superiority against all known Soviet aircraft. Even the MiG-31, their fastest interceptor, could not match the combination of range, tracking fidelity, and missile lethality the Tomcat delivered. And all of this was mobile, carrier-based, deployable, sustainably refueled and protected by the most advanced naval group in the world. The Soviets had spent decades preparing for American jets to fight like they did, rush in, engage close, overwhelm with formations. But the Tomcat never played that game. It created its own game. One where speed wasn't measured in angles, but in milliseconds to lock. Where range wasn't just distance, but time stolen from the enemy's ability to act. And where survival didn't depend on armor or evasion, but on never being seen at all. October 1988, North Arabian Sea. The Soviet Navy's 5th Escadra had dispatched a reconnaissance element, two Tu-95 Bears, escorted by a quartet of MiG-23 MLDs, on a long-range approach toward the U.S. carrier battle group centered around the USS Carl Vinson. The objective was not attack. It was surveillance, presence, a reminder that the Soviet flag flew just as far. The MiG pilots had orders. Close to within 80 kilometers. Maintain formation. Do not engage unless provoked. They never got close. At 280 kilometers out, the Tomcats had already launched. From combat air patrol positions 100 kilometers out from the carrier, 4 F-14s silently began executing a textbook radar sweep. The AWG-9 radars on board scanned the incoming formation, while the intercept officers assigned targets in seconds. 2 Phoenix missiles per Tomcat, 8 missiles total. From that distance, the Soviet pilots had no idea they were being watched. At 210 kilometers, the F-14s fired. The AIM-54s climbed fast, piercing the stratosphere in silence. Their motors burned out long before they entered enemy radar. No trails, no smoke. Just silent, coasting kill packages diving from invisible altitude. By the time the Soviet aircraft crossed the 160-kilometer mark, their radar warning receivers began blinking sporadically. Unfamiliar tones, then hard locks, then chaos. The lead Tu-95 began evasive maneuvers it was never designed to execute. One MiG broke formation entirely. Another descended firing chaff that had no effect. The first kill registered at 140 kilometers. The exercise was non-lethal, but simulated lock-ons and engagements were logged in real time by U.S. Navy systems. The Phoenix missile would have struck the Tu-95 head-on before it ever glimpsed the carrier. The next two MiGs were destroyed before reaching 120 kilometers. The remaining Soviet aircraft turned back, their formation shattered, unable to determine where the threat had come from. The Tomcats never even crossed the 80-kilometer line. When the Soviet flight returned to base, they filed no radar contact with hostile aircraft, no dogfight, no tail pursuit, just system anomalies, lock tones, and kills confirmed by USP's intercept tapes. The next day, a Soviet naval attaché filed a formal complaint claiming provocative action by the U.S. Navy. But the Pentagon response was surgical. All engagements simulated, no violations committed. The real message? You were already dead. We just let you go. The exercise was a public humiliation, not just for the pilots, but for the entire Soviet doctrine. This wasn't a duel, this was erasure at altitude. The Tomcat hadn't just defeated a formation. It had rendered it irrelevant. There was no opportunity for pilot skill, no maneuver, no retaliation. The MiGs never even knew what hit them, because the Tomcats had done what they were built to do: detect, track, assign, destroy, all before visual range. It was a battle not of bravery, but of geometry and silicon. For Soviet strategists, it confirmed a growing horror. Air superiority no longer belonged to the best pilot. It belonged to the fastest computer. And the F-14 was flying it. The truth, when it finally settled in Moscow, wasn't just tactical. It was existential. The Soviet Union's entire air doctrine, built across decades, funded by billions, refined by wars and war games, had collapsed not in a firefight, but in a radar sweep. And the weapon that delivered the blow wasn't even the fastest, stealthiest, or newest. It was simply the most connected. The F-14 Tomcat forced a reevaluation of what war in the air meant. For years, Soviet aviation believed in platform parity. MiG versus Phantom, Su versus Hornet. Aircraft were matched by speed, ceiling, agility. Kill ratios were seen as results of pilot skill, unit cohesion, and sometimes luck. But the Tomcat didn't obey that logic. It didn't fight better in the air. It fought before the air battle began. Every assumption, that radars needed guidance, that missiles couldn't see beyond the horizon, that fighters had to maneuver to win, was rendered obsolete. The Tomcat made visual combat an act of failure. It turned detection into elimination. Time to kill replaced turn radius. The most dangerous pilot wasn't the one who could out-dogfight you. It was the one you never saw. In internal Soviet defense memos, commanders began acknowledging the unthinkable. Even their newest generation, MiG-29s, Su-27s, couldn't reliably survive first contact. Not because of inferior flight performance, but because the Americans had decoupled combat from human reaction. The F-14 system turned every Soviet reaction into a post-mortem. Doctrines that had been gospel, layered radar nets, close-in missile logic, climb speed supremacy, now felt medieval. The age of velocity had given way to the age of information. And worst of all, the USSR couldn't match it. The industrial base was strained. Their computing systems were slower, bulkier, less adaptable. They lacked modular integration. Even if they built something with similar raw numbers, they couldn't replicate the synergy that let the F-14 function as a single-minded execution machine. The Cold War, once defined by bomber gaps and nuclear standoffs, was now fought in invisible corridors of data, radar, and logic loops. And in that new arena, the Soviets were flying blind. Their fighter doctrine hadn't just lost a battle, it had lost relevance. And behind every intercepted flight Behind every pilot who came home silent and shaken, the truth echoed louder. The Americans had changed the rules, and the Tomcat was the enforcer. Thousands of meters above the Arabian Sea, in airspace now silent and empty, a U.S. Navy F-14 Tomcat throttles back to cruise speed. Its wings sweep inward, engines purring at partial power. Inside the cockpit, the radar intercept officer adjusts the AWG-9 scan mode. Nothing hostile in the sky. Nothing approaching. The screen is quiet, but for the enemy it was never quiet. Below, on a Soviet airbase in Turkmenistan, a MiG pilot reviews flight logs from his last patrol. There are anomalies, unexplained pings, sudden lock warnings, flickers that disappeared before they could be traced. He writes them off as interference, but deep down, he knows better. He was seen, calculated, marked. He simply wasn't worth the missile. The F-14 left no burn marks on his fuselage, no dogfight scars, no trace at all. And that was the lesson. The Cold War's final air battles weren't fights at all. They were scans, algorithms, silent kills from machines that operated beyond the limits of human instinct. There was no roar, no chase, just crosshairs placed by systems that didn't hesitate. The Tomcat became a ghost in Soviet memory, not because it was invisible, but because it was inevitable. In Russian aviation museums today, MiGs and Su-27s stand proudly on pedestals. They are honored for their speed, for their agility, for the bravery of the men who flew them. But there is no monument for the moment they realized none of that mattered, that they were flying into a trap laid 100 miles away, that the war in the sky was no longer about movement, but about moment. And the Tomcat always moved first. Today, the F-14 is retired, grounded, replaced by sleeker aircraft and newer systems. But for the men who faced it, the memory remains of a sky where the hunter didn't chase, it simply watched. And when it chose, it struck. From beyond the clouds, beyond the horizon, beyond belief,